In between your viewings of the Twilight series and Morbius, there's a new vampire movie that just hit theaters that you should probably consider squeezing in there. That film is Renfield, starring Nicolas Cage and Nicholas Hoult in the lead roles. I went into this movie 100% blind, knowing only the two lead actors. However, Nicolas Cage being my favorite actor, horror being my favorite genre, I figured this was a shoo-in for something that I'd thoroughly enjoy. I was half right in that I only sort of enjoyed it, but not enough to really rewatch it anytime soon. I'm not saying it's a bad movie, I'm not saying it's a great movie, it's probably just in the middle. And I think part of that comes from my own expectations, or lack thereof. Since I didn't know anything about this movie before I watched it, I sort of formed my own ideas about what I thought it would be. Specifically, I was anticipating something more along the lines of What We Do in the Shadows. What I got was more hot fuzz, but less comedy and more buddy cop rom-com, which in its entirety probably wasn't a terribly written story, it's just not what I was there to see. I was there to see Nicolas Cage play Dracula, a role that I can really only compare to something like Anthony Hopkins' Hannibal Lecter, in that he's the most interesting part of the movie, but really has the least amount of screen time. That being said, the intro to the movie, when Renfield is recounting in a flashback how he met Dracula and what he does for Dracula, that's fantastic. That is sort of what I anticipated the entire movie being about. And if that were the case, I feel like I would have enjoyed it a whole lot more. And I know the movie is called Renfield. I'm not really upset that Dracula or Nicolas Cage was a secondary character. It all really just boils down to, like I said, what my own ideas of the movie were. To explain a little bit more, most of the plot of this movie centers around Nicholas Hoult's Renfield and a local police officer played by Awkwafina trying to take down a crime family, who surprisingly features Ben Schwartz. I was not aware. Very surprised, very taken back. I did like him in this movie a lot as well. To tell you the truth, I don't really remember the details of the crime family story, mostly because I was 100% wholly uninterested. Every time the crime family showed up, every time the police force showed up, every time the FBI showed up, my only thought was, when are we going to get back to Renfield and Dracula? When are we going to tackle their relationship rather than the relationship between this cop, her father, and the crime family? I think the script of this movie started to spread itself a little too thin with how many characters it was introducing and how they introduced those characters. Like I said, the crime, the police, Renfield, and Dracula. It's a lot to cram in when you know the majority of your audience is there to see the two Nicks play their roles. Speaking of, Nicholas Hoult was very, very good in this movie, and I'd love to see him get more prominent roles in Hollywood because he is such a talented actor. Playing Renfield, he's able to portray this sort of unconfident, subservient character that is a product of his environment, and in doing so is able to convey the comedy of the movie in a certain way that only accentuates the relationship between Renfield and Dracula. But Nicolas Cage as Dracula was out of this world. I think Nick Cage is probably one of the very few working actors today that could pull off this style of otherworldly monster. If you know anything about Nicolas Cage in terms of what kind of movies he enjoys, he really likes this film, The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, which is a 1920s German expressionist horror film. It's a silent movie, so there's no spoken dialogue, so a lot of people have to act physically, as everyone did in that time. It's something that really defines that genre of film. So as Nick Cage has done before, he's presented himself in physical manners, such as in the beginning of Face Off when he's dancing with the nuns, that sort of mirror the style of acting that comes out of The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari or other silent expressionist films. While watching him portray Dracula in Renfield, The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari is the one movie that I kept thinking of. In my mind, I'm going, you know what? I bet Nicolas Cage thinks this is exactly what everyone would act like had that movie had spoken word dialogue. The way he holds himself, the way he presents himself, the way he speaks in this movie as Count Dracula, to me feels like it's right out of 1920s expressionism. And in the same sense, whenever Dracula's on screen, his presence is so profound that he commands the scene, whether that be by acting style, by costume design, or by practical effects and makeup. Obviously, we've already covered acting style. Costume design comes in the fact that Dracula has some spectacular suits, and practical effects and makeup from the beginning when he gets burned by the sunlight, every time you see him after that until he's fully regenerated. The makeup team did a fantastic job developing the look of his face so that it appears as if he's regenerating simply from a skeleton. Think sort of Dr. Manhattan regenerating in Watchmen. Now, I mentioned that this was sort of like a buddy cop movie, and that's true, definitely, but it still holds some horror aspects. Like, the blood and gore in this movie was really cranked up to 11. Renfield, of course, has some powers of Dracula, so there's a lot of combat choreography and fight scenes in this film where Renfield has to kill his opponents any way that he feels necessary. Sometimes that means ripping the arms off of one guy and impaling 2 other guys with those arms. Sometimes that means ripping off somebody's face so that you see the skull underneath. I guess they bleed out until they die, who knows? Or it can be as simple as a decapitation. The discrepancy here is that it feels to me like a lot of that budget went to practical effects and makeup, as I mentioned, and the CGI was left sort of by the wayside, not quite as refined. The style of comedy in this movie, having it be sort of lighthearted, kind of makes up for that fact. So it's not a huge detriment, but it's certainly something that will be noticed amongst first viewings, second viewings, third viewings, however many viewings you want to put on this movie. So yeah, it's a funny movie, sure, but the use of blood and gore I can only describe as excessive in a good way. And the ways they kill people are just super creative. I would have loved to be in that writer's room thinking of different ways to murder on-screen characters. Anyway, the black and white opening was super cool. No violence there, by the way. And as the movie progresses into full color, there's a lot of really neo-noir lighting styles. Think John Wick or Mandy, with a lot of very bright, differently colored lights to make a scene where you should know what everything looks like, but the red and blue lights coming from different angles make it seem like a whole new world. It's something in this film that really takes a story that's supposed to be grounded in reality and then just gives it that little touch of fantasy that it really needs. So if I had to give this a final non-numerical score, I would mark it down as overwhelmingly fine. It is super solid as a middle-of-the-road film, something that maybe you put on to pass the time, put on while you're cleaning, or just hang out with your friends at night and put on a funny movie. And yeah, I think that if it is to be remembered down the road, it's remembered for being a comedy. The horror is there, but it's really more of a style touch than a foundation. Nicholas Hoult and Nicolas Cage were fantastic to see them together, but I honestly think that that might be a little bit of a detriment only because we don't see more of it. I don't think I'm alone in this, but I really wish we could have. And to close out, I know, I haven't done it yet. I'll make the obligatory joke. This movie does not suck. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.